Try to understand him. I haven't got time. I told you I heard something in the middle of the night once. What do you want us to do? What do you want us to be?
Hollywood had its chance to make James Edwards a star, but instead, they pushed him to the shadows. Ever wondered why? But here's where it gets crazy. Edwards wasn't just another actor. He defied the roles they gave him. Yet Hollywood turned its back on him, and trust me, it doesn't end there. You're about to hear why Edwards' career was cut short, and how the film industry to this day still doesn't fully acknowledge the impact he had. Edwards' early career and first steps in Hollywood. James Edwards wasn't just another actor trying to make it in Hollywood. He was something special. His first roles were a sign that change was on the horizon, even if Hollywood wasn't ready for it. Let's take a closer look at how Edwards made his mark. James Edwards' career kicked off in a big way with roles that were anything but typical for black actors in the late 1940s and early 1950s. His role in Home of the Brave was nothing short of groundbreaking. The film, set during World War II, featured Edwards as a black soldier who struggles with racism within his own army unit. Back then, movies rarely touched on such heavy topics, especially racism within the military. It was a bold move, and Edwards delivered with intensity and grace. Imagine the pressure he must have felt. Here he was, playing a character that wasn't just a sidekick or a servant. He was a full-fledged person with real struggles, emotions, and depth. This wasn't the typical role for a black actor at the time. In fact, most black actors were cast in the background, often playing menial or servile roles. But Edwards' performance in Home of the Brave helped break through some of those barriers. Next came his role in The Member of the Wedding, a film based on Carson McCullers' novel. Edwards portrayed the brother of a young girl who struggles with her identity as she transitions into adulthood. The film was a deep, introspective look at relationships, and Edwards played his part with an emotional honesty that was rare for any actor, let alone a black man in the 1950s. He wasn't just there to fill a racial quota. His character was essential to the story. This was an actor who could stand alongside anyone in Hollywood, regardless of color. But even with these standout roles, Edwards didn't have it easy. Despite the talent he showed, Hollywood wasn't exactly rolling out the red carpet for him. As was common for black actors of the time, Edwards was often cast in roles that were confined to certain stereotypes. These weren't the complex characters he was capable of portraying. They were the servant, the sidekick, the help. Edwards' real potential was being held back by the racial limitations of the industry. Even though Home of the Brave and The Member of the Wedding showed Edwards' range, Hollywood still saw him through a narrow lens. While he got some good roles, they were often restricted by the biases of the time. Black actors were rarely allowed to play the romantic lead or the heroic protagonist, and when they did, they were often paired with racial stereotypes that made their characters feel one-dimensional. Edwards also had to face what many black actors of the time had to deal with: pay disparities. He didn't earn as much as his white counterparts, even though his performances were just as strong, if not stronger. His career trajectory, while promising, was held back by a system that wasn't ready for him to rise to the top the way his white colleagues did. But here's where it gets even more frustrating. Despite his obvious talent, Edwards' roles were often relegated to the background. He would play characters that weren't allowed to show the depth and complexity that he was capable of. His roles, more often than not, were defined by race. He wasn't just an actor, he was a black actor, and that was how Hollywood saw him. Despite his groundbreaking performances, Edwards found himself boxed in by Hollywood's biases. Why weren't his talents enough to break through? Hollywood's systemic racism and structural exclusion. In the 1940s and 1950s, Hollywood operated within a deeply racist structure, where black actors were typically relegated to supporting roles. These roles were often limited to stereotypes: the servant, the slave, or the secondary character whose purpose was to support the white protagonist's journey. For James Edwards, this meant his talent was constantly stifled. No matter how much potential he showed in films like Home of the Brave and The Member of the Wedding, The roles he was offered rarely allowed him to step into leading roles or characters that showcased his full range as an actor. This system of exclusion was more than just a matter of limited roles. It was a systematic effort to keep black actors from being seen as equals to their white peers. Even though Edwards had the skills to play diverse, complex characters, Hollywood's rigid boundaries meant that black actors were almost always cast in secondary roles. The industry was not ready to embrace them as leading men in romantic films or action-packed stories. For Edwards, the absence of substantial roles wasn't just a missed opportunity. It was a direct result of an industry that refused to see black talent as valuable beyond supporting characters. The lack of representation and opportunities meant Edwards had fewer chances to show the public what he was truly capable of. While Home of the Brave and The Member of the Wedding broke some ground, they were rare exceptions in an industry built on racial exclusion. James Edwards was determined not to be confined by the racial stereotypes Hollywood tried to assign him. However, his struggle against typecasting was an uphill battle. In a system where black actors were only cast in roles that fit within a narrow set of stereotypes, Edwards often had to fight for roles that offered him more substance. Instead of being allowed to play complex leading characters, Edwards was pushed into roles that defined him by his race. While he had the ability to portray a wide range of characters, the industry's racial bias continually limited his opportunities. He didn't want to be the supporting character or the token black man in the background. He wanted to take center stage. But even as he pushed against these boundaries, Hollywood had little interest in casting him outside the box of what it believed a black actor could be. This typecasting had a direct impact on Edwards's career, preventing him from receiving the leading roles he deserved. Hollywood wasn't just slow to cast black actors in key roles, it was actively working to maintain a system where those roles weren't even an option. Despite Edwards' best efforts, the industry held him back, and his fight for more diverse parts went largely unrecognized by the powers that be. As if the limited roles weren't enough, Edwards also faced significant pay disparities compared to his white colleagues. Even when he had prominent roles, his compensation was far below that of his white counterparts. The racial pay gap was glaring and reflected the deeper structural inequality in Hollywood. Edwards' critical success, as seen in films like Home of the Brave, did not translate into the financial rewards or recognition that should have followed. Hollywood also denied Edwards the recognition he deserved. Despite his considerable talent and some critically acclaimed performances, he was largely overlooked in favor of his white peers. Even when he delivered standout performances, his achievements were downplayed or forgotten in the grand narrative of Hollywood's history. This lack of recognition was not just about awards or accolades. It was a denial of the opportunity to build a lasting legacy, which his white contemporaries enjoyed without question. Just as Edwards was fighting for better roles, a new threat emerged. The Hollywood Blacklist would change everything for him. The Hollywood Blacklist. The 1940s and 1950s weren't just difficult for black actors in Hollywood, they were also dangerous. The country was deep in the Red Scare, a period of paranoia where anyone suspected of having left-leaning views or associations with communism was labeled a threat. This was the era of McCarthyism, where politicians and government officials used fear to silence anyone who challenged the status quo. Hollywood became one of the main battlegrounds for this political witch hunt. The House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, was at the center of it all. They started investigating actors, directors, and writers, accusing them of spreading communist propaganda. If someone refused to testify or name others, they were blacklisted, meaning their careers were essentially over. Studios wouldn't hire them and their names were erased from the industry. For black actors like James Edwards, the situation was even worse. Hollywood was already shutting them out of major roles, and now being labeled a communist sympathizer gave the industry another excuse to push them further into the shadows. Edwards had progressive views and was outspoken about racial inequality, which put a target on his back. In an era where simply fighting for civil rights could get someone labeled a radical, Edwards' stance was risky. The intersection of race and politics made things especially difficult. Many black entertainers who spoke out about racism were accused of being part of a communist agenda. The government and Hollywood executives saw activism as a threat. It wasn't just about shutting down communism, it was about keeping the power structure in place. Before the Blacklist, Edwards was on his way to breaking barriers. He had already proven himself in films like Home of the Brave and The Member of the Wedding. He was respected in Hollywood, and his performances showed he had the talent to take on even bigger roles. But the Blacklist changed everything. The moment someone's name was attached to suspected communist ties, the phone stopped ringing. Directors wouldn't cast them, studios wouldn't sign them, and former colleagues suddenly acted like they didn't exist. Edwards found himself in that exact position. His talent was undeniable, but the industry treated him like a liability. He wasn't given the benefit of the doubt. For white actors, getting blacklisted was already devastating. For a black actor who was already fighting to be seen, it was career suicide. Hollywood was looking for reasons not to cast black performers in leading roles, and the Blacklist gave them the perfect excuse to write Edwards off. Even though he was never officially named as a communist, the fear of association was enough to kill opportunities. Studios were too scared to take a chance on him, even though he had never been outspoken about communism itself. But because he had progressive views and had advocated for black rights, he was lumped in with those considered dangerous. Instead of rising in Hollywood, Edwards was pushed further into the background. The roles that once seemed within reach were suddenly impossible to get. He had worked so hard to prove himself, only to be shut out by an industry that never truly accepted him. Edwards' career should have flourished in the 1950s, but the Blacklist left him sidelined. At a time when he should have been securing leading roles and gaining recognition, he was struggling just to stay in the industry. The Blacklist wasn't just a political tool. It was a weapon used to silence voices that Hollywood didn't want to hear. And for James Edwards, it was the beginning of his erasure from the industry. But Edwards wasn't just ignored. Hollywood made sure his name faded from history. Let's look at how they erased him. Hollywood's active and passive erasure of Edwards. James Edwards didn't just fade into the background. Hollywood pushed him there. His talent was undeniable, yet his contributions were slowly buried, both deliberately and through neglect. The erasure wasn't just about him not getting roles. It was about how the industry treated black actors, how history was recorded, and how a system built on exclusion made sure he was forgotten. Hollywood has always had a selective memory. When it came to black actors like James Edwards, that memory got even worse. He was a trailblazer, yet his name rarely came up in mainstream discussions about film history. And it wasn't because he didn't achieve anything, it was because Hollywood didn't want to remember him. Archival footage, press coverage, and industry recognition played a huge role in shaping who got remembered and who didn't. Edwards, despite starring in critically acclaimed films, was rarely the focus of Hollywood's historical narratives. He wasn't celebrated like white actors of his time, even though he had the talent to stand alongside them. His performances were praised when his movies were released, but those accolades didn't turn into lasting recognition. Another reason for his erasure was the industry's reluctance to document and promote black success. While white actors had their achievements cemented in Hollywood's history books, black actors, especially those who challenged racial barriers, were often left out. Edwards wasn't given many opportunities to do interviews, and major publications didn't extensively cover his career the way they did for white stars. His name rarely appeared in retrospectives, award ceremonies, or industry tributes. This wasn't an accident. Hollywood made a habit of excluding black actors from its official narratives, ensuring that future generations wouldn't see their contributions. And then there was the awards issue. Recognition in Hollywood often comes through institutions like the Academy Awards, but during Edwards' time, black actors were largely ignored. Despite giving performances that could have earned Oscar nominations, he was never seriously considered. The system was designed to overlook black talent, and Edwards became another casualty of that erasure. Erasing Edwards wasn't just about racism in Hollywood, it was also about the political environment he lived in. The 1940s and 1950s were a time when the U.S. was deeply divided over race, and Hollywood reflected that division. Edwards' career existed in a system that rarely let black actors rise beyond certain limits. Hollywood's power structure kept black performers in supporting roles, preventing them from becoming mainstream stars. Even when they broke barriers, the industry found ways to diminish their success. Then there was the fear of progress. Edwards represented something Hollywood wasn't ready for, a black actor who didn't conform to stereotypes. He refused to play characters that reinforced racial tropes and that made him a problem for an industry that thrived on those depictions. Instead of embracing his talent, Hollywood sidelined him. The McCarthy era only made things worse. It was a time when being suspected of having left-leaning political beliefs could end a career. Edwards, who had progressive views and associated with people who advocated for racial equality, was an easy target. The industry didn't need an excuse to limit his opportunities, but the political climate gave them one. The result? Fewer roles, less recognition, and an industry that pretended he didn't exist. Even after the Blacklist era ended, Hollywood didn't make an effort to bring him back into the spotlight. He had already been pushed aside, and the industry wasn't interested in correcting that mistake. By the time Edwards' career was nearing its end, his legacy had already been erased. His contributions were undeniable, yet Hollywood acted as if they never happened. This wasn't a case of simply being forgotten. It was an intentional decision to exclude him from the larger narrative of film history. Edwards' career after Hollywood's erasure. Being pushed aside in Hollywood didn't mean James Edwards stopped acting. He kept working, but the roles got smaller, and the industry's respect didn't translate into real opportunities. By the 1960s and 1970s, he was appearing in television and film, but not in the kind of parts that reflected his talent. He was no longer seen as a rising star, just another working actor, despite having paved the way for so many. Hollywood had made its decision. It wasn't just about him aging out of leading roles, it was about the system making sure he never had those roles in the first place. The industry let white actors reinvent themselves, move into different types of roles, and extend their careers. Edwards wasn't given that chance. Instead, he was typecast into supporting characters, military men, and background figures, never the star. The personal toll was undeniable. Being sidelined when you've already proven your talent isn't just frustrating, it's exhausting. He had once been at the forefront of change in Hollywood, but instead of building on that momentum, the industry ignored him. And while he kept working, the recognition and opportunities he deserved never came back. The way Hollywood treated Edwards didn't just affect him, it affected an entire generation of black actors. His erasure meant that one of the earliest examples of a strong, complex black leading man was hidden from view. Future black actors weren't given the chance to follow in his footsteps because Hollywood acted like he had never existed. This had real consequences. Without actors like Edwards in prominent roles, Hollywood continued to push the same stereotypes for black men: sidekicks, comic relief, criminals, or background characters. A figure like Edwards, who had proven that a black actor could carry serious, dramatic roles, should have changed the landscape. Instead, his erasure allowed the industry to delay progress for years. The loss wasn't just his, it was cultural. If Hollywood had embraced him instead of sidelining him, black representation in film could have evolved faster. But by erasing his legacy, the industry maintained the status quo, ensuring that black actors had to fight the same battles over and over again. Even now, James Edwards isn't given the recognition he deserves. His contributions were groundbreaking, but Hollywood's decision to erase him shaped how black actors were treated for decades. The fallout of that decision is still being felt today. Thanks for watching. If you found this video interesting, Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content. Hit the bell icon to stay updated, and click on the next video popping up on your screen. See you next time.